The richest woman in Wyoming. They called her the angel who saved hundreds of children. But when I first saw her, she was digging a grave in frozen ground for her dead daughter, lone, with bare, bleeding hands. I was just a cowboy. I should have kept riding. I didn't. That choice built everything you see here, changed hundreds of lives, including mine. This is her story. The late afternoon sun painted the Wyoming ranch in shades of amber and gold. Nathaniel Crawford sat in his usual chair on the wide porch, his weathered hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey he had not yet touched. At 78 years old, his body showed every winter he had survived, every fence he had mended, every loss he had endured. But his eyes, pale blue and clear, still held the sharpness of a man who had learned to see what others missed. His grandson Jake sat across from him, shoulders hunched, face drawn. The boy was 25 but looked older today. Grief had a way of adding years that never came off. Emily had been dead 3 weeks. The accident had been sudden. A truck on black ice, a guardrail that did not hold. Jake had not been the same since. Nate poured whiskey into a second glass and slid it across the small table between them. Jake took it, but did not drink. His hand shook. "I don't know how to do this, Grandpa," Jake said. His voice cracked on the last word. "I don't know how to keep waking up when she's not here. I don't know how to eat or work or breathe without feeling like I'm doing something wrong." Nate let the silence settle. He had learned long ago that some things could not be rushed, grief least of all. "You think you can't go on," Nate said finally. His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that had talked down spooked horses and calmed frightened children. "You think the world ended when she did?" Jake nodded, unable to speak. Nate took a slow breath and looked out over the land that stretched away from the porch. Miles of prairie grass turning gold in the fading light. In the distance, he could see the buildings of the Catherine Crawford Memorial Children's Home, where lights were beginning to come on in the windows. "I'm going to tell you a story," Nate said, "about the woman who built that place. The woman they called the Angel of Wyoming, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, the woman who saved more children than anyone could count." Jake looked up confused. He had heard of his great-grandmother, Catherine, of course, but he had never heard his grandfather speak of her like this. "But the first time I saw her," Nate continued, his eyes distant now, traveling back across decades into a winter morning that had changed everything. She was burying her child alone in the snow, with her bare hands, in ground so frozen it would not break. Jake straightened in his chair. "She was digging a grave," Nate said, "for a little girl who had died 3 days before, and she was completely alone." The air between them seemed to shift. Jake leaned forward. "What stopped you?" Jake asked. "Why did you help her?" Nate smiled, but it was a sad smile full of memory and weight. "That's the story, son. That's what I need you to hear. Because what I did that day, what she did, what we built together from all that pain, it didn't just change our lives. It changed this whole town. It changed every child who came through those doors." He pointed toward the memorial home again. "So you're going to listen. And when I'm done, you're going to understand something about grief that I didn't learn until I was older than you are now." Jake nodded slowly. He picked up his whiskey and took a small sip, waiting. Nate closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he began the story. The story of his grandfather, the first Nathaniel Crawford, who in 1886, at 32 years old, had encountered a woman bearing her child alone in the snow. And the winter was the coldest he had ever known. The morning was bitter in a way that made breathing hurt. January in Wyoming had always been cruel, but this winter had brought a cold that seemed to have teeth. The kind of cold that killed cattle and turned water to stone. The kind that made even strong men wonder if spring would ever come again. Nathaniel Crawford rode the fence line on the western boundary of the Double Bar Ranch, checking for breaks, watching for cattle that might have wandered too far in search of shelter. His horse, a solid bay gelding named Rust, picked his way carefully through the snow crust that covered everything in white silence. Each step made a sound like breaking glass. Nate had been riding fence for 8 years now. It was steady work, reliable work, the kind that kept a man fed and housed, but asked nothing more of him than his time and his ability to sit a horse in weather that would break lesser men. He preferred it that way. He had learned early that expecting more from life was a mistake. People died, families fell apart, The only thing a man could count on was the next day's work. His breath froze in the air in front of him. The sky hung low and gray, threatening more snow by nightfall. He had 2 more miles of fence to check before he could turn back toward the warmth of the bunkhouse, toward coffee and the wood stove, and Sam's terrible cooking that somehow tasted perfect on days like this. Then he saw her. At first she was just a dark shape in the distance, small against the vast white emptiness of the valley. Nate reined in Rust and squinted against the glare of sun on snow. The valley cemetery lay a quarter-mile away, a lonely cluster of wooden crosses and a few weathered headstones, surrounded by a low fence that was mostly buried in snowdrifts. Someone was there, moving, working at something. Nate sat still watching. The figure was small, a woman he thought, and she was doing something that made no sense. She was swinging something, a shovel. She was trying to dig. Even from this distance, Nate could see the futility of it. The ground had been frozen solid for 6 weeks. Nothing short of dynamite would break it now. He had seen grown men with pickaxes struggle to make even a shallow hole in winter ground like this. But she kept swinging. The shovel rose and fell with mechanical determination. And then Nate saw what sat beside her in the snow, a small pine coffin. The cold seemed to deepen. Nate's chest tightened. He knew what this meant, what it had to mean. A child. She was trying to bury a child, alone. He urged Russ forward down the long slope toward the cemetery. As he drew closer, details emerged from the white blur of distance. The woman was thin, dressed in black that had seen better days. Her coat was too light for this weather. She wore no gloves. Her hands on the shovel handle were wrapped in strips of cloth already dark with what might have been blood. She did not hear him approach. The wind carried sound away across the empty prairie. Nate dismounted slowly, carefully, leading Russ the last 30 yards. He did not want to startle her. The coffin was small enough that a man could have carried it under one arm, but it had been made with care. Nate could see that even from here. The pine boards were fitted carefully. Someone had carved a simple flower pattern into one corner. Someone had taken time, had tried to make something beautiful for whatever small body lay inside. The woman swung the shovel again. She put her whole weight behind it, her body arcing with the effort. The blade struck frozen earth and rang like a bell striking stone. The shock of it jarred up the handle and into her shoulders. He could see her stagger from the impact, but she did not stop. She raised the shovel again. "Ma'am," Nate said quietly. She spun around so fast she nearly fell. The shovel came up like a weapon. Her face was gray with exhaustion and cold. Dark circles shadowed eyes that looked too large for her thin face. She had been crying, but her tears had frozen on her cheeks in tracks of ice. "Stay back," she said. Her voice was hoarse, breaking. "I don't need your help." Nate stood very still. He kept his hands where she could see them, away from his sides, non-threatening. He had gentled enough wild horses to know how to approach something that was terrified and hurting. "I can see that, ma'am," he said. His voice was low, calm, the same tone he used with spooked animals. "But maybe I could help anyway." She stared at him. Her hands trembled on the shovel handle. For a moment, he thought she might swing at him, might try to drive him away with the same desperate determination she had been using on the frozen ground. Then something in her seemed to break. The fight went out of her all at once. Her hands fell to her sides. The shovel slipped from her fingers and landed in the snow with a soft sound that seemed too quiet for the weight of what it meant. Nate stepped forward slowly. He picked up the shovel, testing the weight of it, feeling where her hands had gripped it hard enough to leave indentations in the wood. "Let me," he said. She did not fight him. She sank to her knees beside the small coffin, one hand coming to rest on its rough surface. She did not speak. She just knelt there in the snow, her breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with the cold. Nate positioned himself where she had been standing. He could see the small dent she had managed to make in the frozen earth. Maybe an inch deep, maybe less. She must have been here for hours. He raised the shovel and brought it down with all his strength. The blade bit into the ground barely, and the shock of impact ran up through his arms and into his shoulders. He worked the handle, trying to labor up even a small chunk of frozen dirt. The earth resisted like it was solid rock. Then it gave just a little. A piece the size of his fist broke free. This was going to take a long time. Nate set his jaw and kept digging. He fell into the rhythm of it. Raise the shovel, drive it down, lever, break free a piece again and again. His shoulders began to burn. Sweat formed on his neck despite the cold and froze there almost immediately. He had cleared maybe 18 inches of depth when he heard the sound of approaching horses. He looked up. Two riders were coming down from the ridge to the north. Nate recognized them both. Sam Tucker, the oldest hand at the double bar, a man who had been riding these ranges since before Nate was born, and Thomas Whitaker, the ranch foreman, a quiet man who spoke rarely but whose word could be trusted absolutely. They took in the scene with one glance. Nate digging. The woman kneeling beside a small coffin in the snow. They did not ask questions. They did not need to. Sam dismounted and walked to his saddle. He pulled out a pickaxe that he had been carrying for fence work. Thomas joined him. They approached the grave together, their faces somber but calm. "Need some help?" Sam asked. Nate just nodded. The three men worked in rotation, Sam with the pickaxe breaking the frozen crust, Thomas with a second shovel clearing away what Sam loosened, Nate deepening the hole, finding the rhythm, finding the pace that would let them keep working without collapsing. None of them spoke. The only sounds were metal striking earth, the rasp of heavy breathing, and the wind moving through the bare branches of a cottonwood tree at the cemetery's edge. An hour passed. The hole was 2 feet deep, then 3, finally 4 feet, deep enough to be proper, deep enough to be respectful. Sam stepped back first. He removed his hat and held it against his chest. Thomas and Nate did the same. Their breath steamed in the cold air. All three men were covered in a fine layer of ice crystals from their frozen sweat. The woman stood slowly. Her legs trembled. She looked at the three of them, and for the first time, Nate saw something like recognition in her eyes. She had been beyond seeing before, lost in her own desperate task. Now she looked at them and seemed to understand that they were real, that they had come, that she was not alone anymore. She moved to the coffin. She bent and lifted it. It was so light that Nate's chest hurt watching her. A child that small should not exist. A child that small should not be dead. Nate moved to help her, but she shook her head. Just a small movement, but firm. She needed to do this part herself. He understood. He stepped back. She knelt at the grave's edge and lowered the coffin with shaking arms. Her breath came in short gasps. The pine box settled on the frozen earth at the bottom of the hole with a soft sound that seemed too quiet for something so final. She stayed kneeling there, staring down. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Nate wondered what words she was saying, what goodbye she was trying to speak. After a long moment, she looked up at him. Her eyes were empty, hollowed out by something that went far deeper than simple grief. Nate had seen grief before. He had lost his younger sister Jenny to drowning when he was 18. He had watched his father grow silent and distant, after that watched his mother stop singing. He had stood at graves of friends and neighbors and hired men killed in accidents or illness. But this, a mother burying her only child alone in a January cemetery, this was different. He reached into his coat and pulled out the worn Bible he always carried. His hands were stiff with cold as he opened to the passage he wanted. The pages were familiar, creased from use. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if you'd permit me." She looked up at him with those empty eyes. She nodded once. Nate's voice was steady as he read. The words came from Isaiah, from a chapter he had memorized years ago when Jenny died and he had needed something to hold on to. "He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. He continued reading verses about children and heaven, about comfort for those who mourn, about mercy that did not fail even when everything else did. His voice was the only sound besides the wind. Sam and Thomas stood with heads bowed. The woman's shoulders began to shake. Then the sobs came, wrenching sounds that seemed torn from somewhere deep inside her. She bent forward over the open grave and her whole body convulsed with the force of her crying. Nate kept reading. "The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit." When he finished, he closed the Bible carefully and put it back in his coat. The silence that followed felt sacred somehow, heavy with meaning. Nate nodded to Sam and Thomas. Together they began filling the grave. They worked gently, respectfully, lowering the dirt in carefully rather than just shoveling it in. Sam found 2 sturdy pine branches and lashed them together with leather cord from his saddle, forming a simple cross. The mound of earth grew slowly. When it was done, Nate patted it smooth with the back of the shovel. Sam placed the cross at the head of the grave, driving it deep enough to withstand the wind. It would do until spring, until a proper stone could be carved. "She'll need a marker come spring," Thomas said quietly to Nate. "I can carve one," Sam offered. "That would be good," Nate replied. The woman had not moved. She stood beside the grave, each arms wrapped around herself, staring at the fresh turned earth. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon. The temperature would plummet once darkness fell. Nate glanced at Sam and Thomas. They understood, without words being spoken. This was a language they all knew, the silent communication of men who had worked together long enough to read each other's thoughts. "We'll head back to the ranch," Sam said. He touched his hat brim toward the woman. "Ma'am, you have our sympathies." Thomas nodded his agreement. They mounted their horses and rode off, leaving Nate alone with the widow. Nate stood there for a moment, uncertain. Then he spoke. "Where's your place?" he asked. The woman turned to look at him. Her voice, when it came, sounded distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Weatherby Cabin, 2 miles east." "I'll follow you home," Nate said. "Make sure you get there safe." She turned fully toward him now. For a moment, he thought she would refuse. She had that look about her, the look of someone who had learned not to accept help, because help always came with strings attached. But then she just nodded and walked to her horse, which was tied to the cemetery fence. The horse was thin, not starving but close. It had not been cared for properly in some time. The woman mounted stiffly, moving like someone much older than her years. She could not have been more than 26 or 27, but grief had aged her. Nate swung onto Rust and followed as she rode out of the cemetery. He kept his distance, not crowding her, giving her space. The sun set behind them, painting the snow orange and pink. Beautiful colors that seemed wrong for such a day. The woman rode with her back straight, but Nate could see her shoulders shake with silent sobs every few minutes. She would pull herself together, breathe deeply, then break again. Over and over, the cycle of grief that could not be controlled. The cabin came into view after about 20 minutes of riding. It was a small structure tucked against a hillside for wind protection. Smoke rose from the chimney. She must have left a fire burning before she came to the cemetery. She dismounted and went inside without looking back. A moment later, lamplight appeared in the window. Nate waited until he was certain she was settled and safe. Then he turned Rust toward home. But before he could move, the cabin door opened again. The woman stood there in the yellow light spilling from inside. She looked at him for a long moment. "Why did you stop?" she asked. Her voice was stronger now, but still hollow. "You don't know me. Why did you help?" Nate sat very still in his saddle. The question hung in the cold air between them. He could have given her a simple answer, could have said it was the decent thing to do, the neighborly thing. But something about her eyes, about the rawness of this day, made him tell the truth instead. 40 years ago, he said slowly, my little sister drowned. I was there. I tried to save her, but the ice was too thin. I couldn't reach her in time." He paused. The memory was as sharp now as it had been when he was 18. "My father dug her grave alone," Nate continued. "I was too broken to help. My mother was too shattered to even come to the cemetery. He did it by himself in winter ground just like this. I watched from the house. I swore that if I ever saw someone digging a grave alone, if I ever had the chance to be the help my father needed and didn't get, I would stop. I would help." The woman stared at him. For the first time since he had met her, he saw something in her face beside despair. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. She nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she went back inside and closed the door. Nate sat there a moment longer, looking at the small cabin with its single window glowing warm in the gathering darkness. Then he turned Russ toward the double bar and rode into the night. He did not see the 3 men on horseback who sat watching from the ridge above the cabin, did not see them lower their field glasses and turn their horses away, did not hear them talking in low voices about the woman in the cabin, about the land she lived on, about plan that had been set in motion weeks ago and could not be stopped now. One of the men was Wade Garrett, owner of the Iron Creek Ranch, the largest spread in the county. He smiled to himself as he rode away. Things were proceeding nicely. The mail-order bride was alone, vulnerable, grieving. It would not take much to convince her to leave. And once she was gone, that valuable land with its water rights and timber would be his. Just as it should have been years ago. Inside the cabin, Catherine Palmer sat at her rough wooden table without removing her coat. She could not feel her hands, could not feel her feet, could not feel anything except the vast emptiness that filled her chest where her heart used to be. 3 days ago, Ruby had been alive. Feverish, yes. Sick, yes. But alive. Catherine had ridden 8 miles through darkness to fetch Dr. Morrison from town, her infant daughter wrapped in blankets and burning hot against her chest. The doctor had been kind. He had followed her back to the cabin as quickly as his old mare could manage. But by the time they arrived, Ruby's breathing had changed. By dawn, she was gone. The doctor had helped Catherine wash the small body, had wrapped it in clean linen. Then he had left, promising to send word to neighbors. But no one had come. It was January, the hardest month. Everyone was dealing with their own struggles, their own stock to feed their own challenges with this brutal winter. Catherine had understood. She had always understood. When her husband, when the man she had come here to marry, when Silas Weatherby had died under mysterious circumstances just days before she arrived, neighbors had offered sympathy. But sympathy had limits. People had their own lives, their own troubles. Eventually, everyone drifted back to their own concerns. Catherine had learned to manage alone. She had taught herself to handle the work that should have been a man's work. Feeding the few cattle Silas had left behind. Mending fence. Hauling water from the creek. She had been proud of her independence. But when Ruby got sick, when the fever would not break, when the little girl's breathing grew shallow and strange, pride had meant nothing. Catherine had needed help, and there had been none. Just her and Ruby and the long dark night. Now there was just her. She had built the coffin herself. She had measured it carefully using pine boards that Silas had saved for some other purpose. The irony was not lost on her. She had lined it with fabric from the wedding dress she had brought from Philadelphia, the dress she had planned to wear when she married Silas. White linen carefully cut and sewn. Ruby had deserved something beautiful. This morning she had loaded the coffin onto the small wagon and driven to the cemetery. She had unloaded it herself, though it had taken 3 tries because her hands kept slipping and she kept having to stop to cry. Then she had picked up the shovel with grim determination, fully intending to dig the grave alone. But the ground had defeated her. After 2 hours of futile effort, her arms shaking, her hands blistered and bleeding through the cloth she had wrapped them in, she had made almost no progress. The earth was simply too frozen. Then he had appeared. The cowboy, Nathaniel Crawford. She knew his name from town, though they had never spoken. He worked for the Double Bar. He had a reputation for being quiet, reliable, someone who kept to himself but could be counted on. He had taken the shovel without hesitation, had not asked questions or offered empty comfort. He had just dug. And when his friends arrived, they had dug too. 3 strangers working in the cold to help her bury her daughter. The kindness of it had broken something in Catherine. All the fierce independence she had built up since coming west, all the walls she had constructed to survive alone, they had crumbled in the face of simple human compassion. She finally moved now, pulling off her coat with stiff fingers. Her hands were numb. Her feet too. She added wood to the stove and stood close to it, trying to thaw. But the cold she felt was not the kind that heat could touch. Tomorrow she would wake up and Ruby would still be gone. The day after that, the same. An endless succession of days without her daughter, without the small, warm weight of her, without the sound of her laugh, or the feel of her tiny hand gripping Catherine's finger. Catherine thought about the cowboy reading from his Bible, the steadiness of his voice, the way he had stayed until the grave was filled and marked, the way he had followed her home to make sure she arrived safely. Maybe surviving alone was not the same as living. Maybe there was another way. But tonight she was too tired to think about it. Tonight she could only sit by the stove and let the tears come. She did not know yet about Wade Garrett, did not know about the men watching her cabin, did not know that her arrival in Wyoming territory had disrupted plans that had been years in the making, did not know that the land she lived on, the small parcel that Silas Weatherby had claimed and improved, was worth far more than she could imagine to men who dealt in water rights and timber access in the quiet accumulation of power. She did not know that Silas's death had not been an accident, that his horse's saddle had been carefully cut to fail at just the right moment, that he had died because he refused to sell, because he had planned to bring a mail-order bride west and start a family and keep this land in honest hands. She did not know any of this yet, but she would learn, soon. For now, she just sat by the stove in the cabin that smelled like smoke and loneliness and tried to imagine a tomorrow that did not hurt quite so much as today. Outside, the temperature dropped below zero. The stars came out hard and bright and cold. The wind picked up, blowing snow across the prairie in sheets of white that erased all tracks, all evidence that anyone had been in the cemetery today at all. But the grave remained. The cross stood firm against the wind. And somewhere in the darkness, riding back toward the Double Bar Ranch, Nathaniel Crawford thought about a woman with empty eyes in a child's coffin made with careful hands and wondered why he could not stop thinking about her. Nate Crawford sat in his chair on the porch in 2024, the whiskey still untouched in his glass. Jake had not moved, had not interrupted. He sat forward in his chair, completely absorbed. "That's where it started," Nate said quietly. "That's the day everything changed." "You loved her from that moment?" Jake asked. Nate shook his head. "No, not love, not yet. That came later. That day I just saw someone who needed help, someone who was trying to do an impossible thing alone. And I remembered what it felt like to watch my father do the same thing. I remembered the weight of that, the loneliness of it." He paused, looking out over the land. "I went back the next day," Nate continued. "Told myself I was just checking on her, making sure she had enough firewood, that the cabin was sound. But that would have been a lie. Truth was, I could not stop thinking about her, about that small coffin, about the way she had tried to dig through frozen ground with her bare hands." "What happened when you went back?" Jake asked. Nate smiled, but it was a complicated smile. Memory and pain, and something like awe all mixed together. "That's when I started learning who Catherine Palmer really was. And that's when I started to understand that sometimes the people who look the most broken are actually the strongest ones of all." He looked at his grandson. "You want to hear the rest?" Jake nodded without hesitation. "Then let me tell you about the next morning. About what I found when I rode back to that cabin. Because that's when I realized Catherine was not just grieving. She was running. She was hiding. And she was in more danger than either of us knew." The morning after the burial, Nate returned to the Weatherby cabin as promised. He had loaded his saddlebags with supplies before leaving the Double Bar, telling himself it was just the decent thing to do. A woman alone needed firewood, needed coffee and flour, needed someone to check that her stock had water and shelter. But he knew it was more than that. All through the night, he had seen her face, those hollow eyes, the way her hands had trembled on the shovel before she let it go, the terrible lightness of that small coffin. He had not slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jenny's face beneath the ice, saw his father bent over a shovel in frozen ground, digging alone because his only son was too shattered to help. Some wounds never fully healed. They just became part of the landscape of who you were. The cabin looked different in morning light, smaller somehow, more vulnerable. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. She was awake then, had made it through the night. Nate dismounted and tied Russ to the fence post. He pulled a load of split firewood from behind his saddle, stacked it carefully by the cabin door. Then he knocked 3 soft raps that would not startle. The door opened slowly. Catherine Palmer stood there in the same black dress she had worn yesterday, but her hair was combed, now pulled back severely from her face. She looked at him with those same empty eyes, but there was something else there too. Wariness, maybe. Uncertainty. "Mr. Crawford," she said. Her voice was hoarse, like she had been crying all night, which she probably had. "Ma'am," Nate replied. He gestured to the firewood. "Thought you might need this." She looked at the wood, then back at him. "You didn't have to come back." "I know," Nate said simply, "but I did." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to understand what he wanted, what this would cost her. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "There's coffee," she said, "if you want some." The cabin was sparse but clean. One main room served as kitchen and living space with a wood stove against one wall and a rough wooden table with 2 chairs. A doorway led to what must be a small bedroom. The furniture was handmade, sturdy but plain, a man's touch everywhere. Silas Weatherby's touch. But there were small things that spoke of Catherine's presence too. A violin hanging on the wall, its wood worn smooth from years of playing. a stack of books on a shelf near the stove, a photograph in a simple frame on the table showing two young women with similar features, arms around each other, smiling. Catherine followed his gaze to the photograph. "My sister Rose," she said quietly, "and me, 3 years ago." She turned away and busied herself with the coffee pot. Her movements were stiff, careful, like someone trying very hard to hold themselves together. Nate sat at the table without being asked. He had learned that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was just be present. Not fussing, not trying to fix anything, just there. Catherine poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought them to the table. She sat across from him, both hands wrapped around her cup as if drawing warmth from it. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Catherine looked up at him. "I came here 4 weeks ago," she said. The words came out flat, rehearsed like she had been practicing them. "To marry Silas Weatherby. We'd exchanged letters for 6 months. He needed a wife. I needed a new start." She paused, staring into her coffee. "He promised a home, safety. He promised to take Ruby as his own daughter." Her voice broke on the name. She breathed deeply, forcing control back into her throat. "I arrived at the train station in Laramie. He wasn't there. A man from town, the station master, he told me Silas had died 3 days before. Horse accident, he said. Saddle broke, threw him into rocks, dead before anyone found him." Nate listened without interrupting. He could see how much it cost her to speak these words, to relive this. "I had nowhere to go," Catherine continued. "No money to return east. The station master said Silas had left instructions that if anything happened to him, his intended bride should go to the cabin. That it was mine by right of our agreement. So I came here, with Ruby." She looked at Nate directly now. 3 days ago she got sick. Fever. I rode to town for the doctor. He came. He tried. But she died anyway. The silence that followed was heavy with all the things that could not be said. All the what-ifs and if-onlys that grief carried like stones. "I'm sorry for your loss," Nate said. The words felt inadequate, but they were true. Catherine's laugh was bitter. "Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't change anything." "No," Nate agreed quietly. "It doesn't." She looked at him, surprised maybe by his honesty. Most people he knew tried to soften grief with platitudes. Tried to tell you it would get better, that time would heal, that God had a plan. As if any of that mattered when you were drowning. "You asked me yesterday why I stopped," Nate said. "Why I helped." Catherine nodded. "I told you about my sister, about watching my father dig alone. But there's more to it than that." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When Jenny died, I thought it was my fault. I was the older brother. I should have stopped her from going on the ice. Should have been faster when it broke. Should have saved her." He took a breath. "It took me years to understand that some things can't be stopped, can't be saved, that sometimes terrible things happen and there's nothing you could have done differently." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I should have gotten the doctor sooner. Should have known Ruby was that sick. Should have—" "No," Nate said firmly. "You did everything you could, everything. And it still wasn't enough, because sometimes it isn't. Sometimes people die and it's nobody's fault, and there's no reason for it except that life is hard and cruel and unfair." The tears spilled over now, running down Catherine's face, but she did not look away from him. "How do you live with that?" she whispered. "How do you keep going when you know the world is that cruel?" Nate met her eyes. "You just do, one day at a time. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you find people who understand, who've walked through their own fire, and you walk together for a while." They sat in silence after that. The coffee grew cold. Outside, wind rattled the window frames. It was not comfortable, this silence, but it was honest. And sometimes that was enough. Eventually, Nate stood. "I should let you rest, but I'll come by tomorrow. Check on your stock. Make sure your barn door is holding. Winter's not done with us yet." Catherine stood too. She walked him to the door. "Why?" she asked. "You don't owe me anything." Nate put on his hat. "Maybe I'm not doing it for you. Maybe I'm doing it because it's the kind of thing someone should have done for my father. For me. Maybe I'm just trying to be the help I needed and didn't get." He stepped out into the cold. "I'll be back tomorrow." Catherine watched him mount his horse and ride away. She stood in the doorway long after he disappeared over the rise until the cold drove her back inside. That night alone in the cabin, Catherine let herself remember. Let the memories she had been holding back flood through her. Philadelphia 3 years ago. Rose had been so beautiful on her wedding day. The Brennan family was wealthy, influential. Robert Brennan was handsome and charming and promised Rose everything a young woman could want. Catherine had been happy for her sister, had ignored the small signs that something was wrong. The way Robert held Rose's arm too tightly, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. The first year of marriage, Rose had made excuses. She was clumsy, she said, had fallen downstairs, had walked into a door. Catherine had wanted to believe her, had needed to believe that her sister was happy. Then Rose got pregnant, and the excuses stopped because the bruises could not be hidden anymore. Robert drank. When he drank, he got angry. And when he got angry, Rose suffered for it. Catherine had begged Rose to leave, had offered to take her in to help her start over. But Rose was afraid. The Brennans were powerful. Robert had told her that if she left, she would never see her child, that he would make sure she had nothing. No money, no home, no future. So Rose stayed. And when Ruby was born, Rose's body had been so damaged from the beatings that the birth nearly killed her. The doctor had said there were internal injuries, old injuries that had never healed properly. Rose bled for 3 days after Ruby was born. On the 4th day, she died. Catherine had been there, had held her sister's hand, had promised to take care of Ruby, to keep her safe from the Brennans, from Robert. Robert had lasted another year, drinking more, growing more violent. Then one night he had fallen down the stairs in his own house, too drunk to catch himself. His neck broke. He died instantly. Catherine had thought it was over then, had thought she could raise Ruby in peace. But Robert's older brother Harrison had other ideas. Harrison Brennan was a banker, wealthy in his own right, and he wanted Ruby. The last Brennan heir, the child who should have been his brother's legacy. He had taken Catherine to court claiming she was an unfit guardian, a spinster with no income, no prospects. He could provide Ruby with everything: education, society, the Brennan name. Catherine had fought him, had spent what little money she had on lawyers, but she was losing. The judge was a friend of Harrison's. The verdict was predetermined, so Catherine had run. In the middle of the night, with Ruby wrapped in blankets, she had fled Philadelphia. She had heard of mail-order bride agencies, women who went west to marry ranchers and miners, men who needed wives and didn't ask too many questions about the past. She had found Silas Weatherby's advertisement in a newspaper. A rancher in Wyoming Territory, a widower, no children, wanted a wife who could read and keep house and help him build a life. Catherine had written to him, had told him she had a young daughter. Silas had written back saying a child would be welcome, that he had always wanted children, but his first wife had died before they could have any. They had exchanged letters for 6 months. Silas's handwriting was careful, his words thoughtful. He seemed kind, honest, and most importantly, he was 2,000 miles from Philadelphia, far enough that Harrison could never find them. Catherine had packed their few belongings and bought train tickets with the last of her money. The journey had taken 10 days. Ruby had been fussy, restless, but Catherine had been hopeful. For the first time in years, she had seen a future that did not involve fear. Then she had arrived in Laramie and learned that Silas was dead, and all that hope had died with him. But she had stayed. Where else could she go? She had no money, no family, and at least here in this remote cabin, Harrison could not find them, until Ruby got sick, until the fever took her in 3 terrible days, until Catherine found herself completely alone in a way she had never been alone before. Now sitting in the dark cabin, Catherine wondered if this was punishment for running, for stealing Ruby from the Brennans, for trying to build a life on lies and desperation. But no, she could not believe that. Ruby had deserved better than the Brennans, had deserved safety and love and a chance at happiness. If Catherine had done wrong by taking her, then it was a wrong she would do again without hesitation. She just wished it had not cost Ruby her life. The next morning, Nate returned as promised. He brought more firewood and a sack of supplies from the Double Bar's stores: coffee, flour, beans, salt. Basic things, but things Catherine was running low on. "I can't pay you for these," Catherine said, standing in the doorway. Didn't ask you to, Nate replied. He carried the supplies inside and set them on the table. Just being neighborly. Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. Every 2 or 3 days, Nate would ride over to check on things. He fixed the barn door that hung crooked, its hinge broken. He checked Catherine's small herd of cattle, made sure they had access to water, that none had wandered too far. He split more firewood when her stack got low. He never stayed long, never made her feel obligated to entertain him or make conversation. But slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Catherine told him about Boston, about growing up as a teacher's daughter, about libraries and theaters and music halls, about a world that seemed impossibly far away now. Nate told her about the ranch, about the horses he helped break, about the satisfaction of good hard work. He did not say much, but what he said was thoughtful, considered. One afternoon, he noticed the violin on the wall. "You play?" he asked. Catherine looked at it. "Used to, before." She trailed off. "Play something now," Nate said. She hesitated. The violin had been Rose's. Catherine had not touched it since burying Ruby. But something about the way Nate asked, quiet and without pressure, made her reach for it. Her fingers were stiff at first. The bow felt strange in her hand, but muscle memory took over. She played a simple folk tune, something her mother had taught both sisters when they were girls. The notes filled the cabin, chasing away some of the silence that had been suffocating her for weeks. When she finished, Nate was smiling slightly. "That was real fine," he said. She played another song, then another. Nate sat at her table drinking coffee, listening. And for the first time since Ruby died, Catherine felt something other than grief, not happiness, not yet, but maybe the distant possibility of it. That evening when Nate left, Catherine realized she had smiled. Just briefly, when he made a quiet comment about Sam's cooking being barely edible despite years of practice. But it had happened. The ice was beginning to thaw. The third week after Ruby's burial, Wade Garrett came to call. Catherine was outside trying to drive her small herd of cattle closer to the barn before the next storm came. The animals were scattered, resistant to being herded. She was frustrated, cold, on the edge of tears when she heard the horse approaching. She looked up to see a man she did not recognize. He was handsome, well-dressed, riding a beautiful chestnut mare. His clothes were expensive, his saddle well-made. Everything about him spoke of money and confidence. He tipped his hat as he approached. "Mrs. Palmer, I presume?" Catherine straightened, suddenly aware of how she must look. Wind-blown, red-faced from cold, struggling with stubborn cattle. "Yes, and you are Wade Garrett." He dismounted with easy grace. "I own the Iron Creek Ranch just north of here. I wanted to pay my respects. I heard about your loss, your daughter. I'm very sorry." There was something about his sympathy that felt practiced, smooth, but Catherine nodded. "Thank you. I was also a friend of Silas Weatherby's," Wade continued. "We were neighbors for years. His death was a terrible shock." "You were at his funeral?" Catherine asked. "I was out of town at the time, unfortunately. Cattle business in Cheyenne. By the time I returned, he was already buried." Wade looked around at the cabin, the barn, the land. "This is a fine property. Silas worked hard to build it up." "Yes," Catherine said, uncertain where this was going. "But it's a lot for a woman alone to manage," Wade said. His tone was kind, concerned. "Especially in winter. Especially with your recent grief." Catherine's spine stiffened. "I'm managing." "Of course you are," Wade smiled. "But I wanted you to know, if you ever need help, anything at all. I'm just a few miles north. Don't hesitate to call on me." "That's kind of you," Catherine said carefully. Wade walked his horse a few steps closer. "In fact, I'd be happy to buy this land from you. Fair price. You could go back east, start fresh somewhere, without all these painful memories." There it was. Catherine had wondered when someone would make this offer. Land was valuable here. Water rights especially. Silas's property had good water access. She had learned enough in her few weeks here to know that. "I appreciate the offer," Catherine said, keeping her voice level. "But I'm not interested in selling." Something flickered in Wade's eyes, just for a moment. Then the smile returned. "Of course, I understand, but the offer stands. Winter's long out here, Mrs. Palmer. You might change your mind." He mounted his horse smoothly, but before he left, he looked toward the horizon and said almost casually, "I see Nathaniel Crawford's been helping you. That's good of him. Though I'd be careful. People talk. A young widow and an unmarried cowboy spending time together. Appearances matter in a small community. The words were delivered gently, almost apologetically. But the threat underneath was clear. Catherine felt her face flush, but whether from anger or embarrassment, she could not tell. "Mr. Crawford has been a good neighbor," she said firmly. "That's all." Wade tipped his hat. "Of course, I meant no offense, just looking out for your reputation. You're new here. You might not know how things work." He turned his horse. "Good day, Mrs. Palmer. Remember, if you need anything, I'm close by." He rode off at an easy canter, confident and relaxed. Catherine stood there shaking. Not from cold this time, from anger, from the sudden understanding that she was more vulnerable here than she had realized. Wade Garrett had been polite, concerned, helpful. But underneath all of that, she had felt something else. A proprietary interest, like he was already planning how to take this land. That afternoon when Nate arrived to check on the cattle, Catherine told him about Wade's visit. Nate's face hardened. What did he want? To buy the land. He said Silas was his friend. Silas didn't have friends, Nate said flatly. He had neighbors. There's a difference. And Wade Garrett was never a neighbor Silas trusted. Why not? Nate was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. Wade's been trying to buy this land for years. The water rights here are valuable. His property's good, but it doesn't have the same access to the creek. Silas always said no, said he didn't trust Wade's intentions. Catherine felt cold settle into her bones. You think Silas's death wasn't an accident? Nate looked at her steadily. I think you should be careful. I think you should lock your doors at night. And I think if Wade or anyone else comes around offering help that seems too good to be true, you should be suspicious. That night, Catherine did lock her doors. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. Every sound seemed threatening now. Around midnight, she heard it. Horses, multiple horses, riding close to the cabin. She got up quietly, moved to the window. Through a crack in the curtains, she could see dark shapes on horseback. 3 men, maybe 4. They were talking in low voices. She could not make out the words, but she could hear the tone. Threatening, deliberate. They circled the cabin once, then rode off toward the barn. Catherine held her breath, terrified. What were they doing? After about 10 minutes, she heard the horses again. They rode away into the night. She did not sleep the rest of the night, just sat with her back against the wall, Silas's old rifle across her lap, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, Catherine went outside to check on the cattle. Her stomach dropped. The fence on the south pasture had been cut. All her cattle had scattered during the night. It would take hours to round them up, and she was not skilled enough to do it alone. The message was clear. Leave, or things will get worse. Catherine stood there in the cold morning light, looking at the cut fence, and felt the first real fear she had known since running from Philadelphia. She had thought she was safe here, thought distance and obscurity would protect her. But she had been wrong. There were different kinds of danger in the world, and she had walked right into one of them. She needed help, and the only person she could think to ask was Nathaniel Crawford. Back on the porch in 2024, Nate paused in his story. Jake was leaning forward, completely absorbed. Wade Garrett tried to scare her away, Jake said. Yes, Nate confirmed. That was just the beginning. Wade wanted that land, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. Did she come to you for help? Nate nodded slowly. The next day she rode to the double bar. First time she'd left the cabin since the burial. She was scared. I could see it in her eyes, and that's when I realized something. What? That I cared about her. Not just as a neighbor, not just as someone who needed help. I cared about her specifically, about what happened to her. And that scared me almost as much as Wade Garrett scared her. Why were you scared? Jake asked. Nate looked at his grandson. Because everyone I'd ever cared about had died. My parents, Jenny, and I'd convinced myself that caring about people was too dangerous. That keeping distance was safer. But Catherine, she was breaking through all those walls I'd built. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to risk losing someone again. He stood up, joints creaking with age. Come on, he said. Let me show you something before we continue. They walked down from the porch across the yard toward the old cemetery where the first Crawford family members were buried. And there, surrounded by careful gardens, was Ruby Palmer's grave. The stone was weathered now, but still clear. Beside it was a bench, and beside the bench was a small plaque. Jake read it aloud. Catherine Crawford Memorial Garden, where grief became hope. Your grandmother planted every flower here herself, Nate said. Over 50 years. This was her favorite place to come and think. And you know what she told me once? Jake shook his head. She said Ruby's death didn't end her life. It changed her life. And that change, as painful as it was, led her to Mim. Led her to building something bigger than herself. Led her to saving hundreds of children who might otherwise have had nowhere to go. He put his hand on Jake's shoulder. Emily's death is going to change your life too. It already has. But you get to choose what that change means, whether it destroys you or transforms you. They stood there in silence for a moment. Then Nate said, ready to hear what happened next? Yes, Jake said quietly. Then let's go back. Because this is where things got dangerous. This is where Catherine's past caught up with her. And this is where I had to decide if I was brave enough to stand beside her when the real threats showed up. They walked back to the porch together as the sun began to set over Wyoming, painting the sky in the same colors it had painted that winter evening in 1886 when everything started to change. Catherine Palmer had never been to the Double Bar Ranch. In her weeks in Wyoming, she had kept mostly to the Weatherby cabin, venturing into town only when absolutely necessary. But now, standing at the fence line where Nate had told her the ranch began, she felt her resolve waver. What was she doing here? What could a cowboy do against men who cut fences in the night, against threats she could not see or name? She had run from Philadelphia to escape powerful men. Had she simply traded one danger for another? But the cut fence had made the choice for her. She could not round up the cattle alone, could not survive here if every night brought new sabotage, could not keep running forever. She urged her horse forward through the gate and down the long drive toward the cluster of buildings that made up the ranch headquarters. It was larger than she had expected. A main house, several barns, corrals, bunkhouses, dozens of horses in the pastures. This was a working operation, successful and well-maintained. A black man in his late 50s emerged from one of the barns. He had the weathered look of someone who had spent his life outdoors, but his eyes were sharp and kind. He studied Catherine for a moment, then recognition dawned on his face. You're the widow woman Nate helped, he said. Not a question. Catherine nodded. I'm looking for Mr. Crawford. Is he here? Sam Tucker, the man said, introducing himself. And yes, Nate's in the breaking corral out back. I'll fetch him. He disappeared around the barn. Catherine waited, trying to calm her racing heart. She felt exposed here, vulnerable. What if she was making a mistake? What if asking for help would only bring more trouble? Then Nate appeared, walking quickly from behind the barn. He was covered in dust, his shirt darkened with sweat despite the cold. He must have been working with horses. When he saw her, his expression shifted from surprise to immediate concern. Catherine. He reached her horse in a few long strides. What's wrong? The fact that he assumed something was wrong, that he did not waste time on pleasantries or pretend this was a social call, made Catherine's throat tighten. She dismounted, her legs unsteady. I need help, she said. Nate glanced at Sam, who had followed him. The barn, Nate said quietly. Private. They walked to the nearest barn, into the shadowed interior that smelled of hay and leather and horses. Once inside, away from watching eyes, Nate turned to Catherine. Tell me, he said, and she did. Everything. The words came out in a rush, like water through a broken dam. She told him about the men on horseback circling her cabin in the night, about the cut fence, about Wade Garrett's visit and his too smooth offer to buy her land, about feeling watched, threatened, unsafe in a place that was supposed to be her sanctuary. Nate listened without interrupting, his face growing darker as she spoke. When she finished, there was a long silence. You should have told me sooner, he said finally. I thought I could handle it. I thought if I just kept my head down, they'd leave me alone. Catherine, Nate's voice was gentle but firm. These men aren't going to leave you alone. Wade Garrett wants that land. He's wanted it for years, and he's not the kind of man who takes no for an answer. Catherine felt tears threatening. She blinked them back. I don't know what to do. I have nowhere else to go. No money, no family. Something in Nate's expression shifted. He took a half step closer, then seemed to catch himself. There's more you're not telling me. Isn't there? Catherine's breath caught. How did he know? You're not just running from Wade Garrett, Nate said quietly. You were running before you even got here. That's why you became a mail-order bride. That's why you're so scared. The tears came now hot against her cold cheeks, and once they started, she could not stop them. She told him everything. About Rose, about Robert Brennan and his cruelty, about Harrison and his determination to take Ruby, about the court case she was losing, about running in the night with a child who was not even legally hers. Ruby wasn't my daughter, Catherine said, the words choking out. She was my niece. My sister died giving birth to her. Rose's husband beat her, and the injuries they made the birth too dangerous. Rose bled to death 3 days after Ruby was born. She looked up at Nate through her tears. I took Ruby and I ran. Harrison Brennan Roberts' brother, he wanted her. He's rich, powerful. He took me to court to get custody. And I knew I'd lose. The judge was his friend, so I left. I became a mail-order bride to get far enough away that they could never find us. But Ruby died anyway, Catherine whispered. I saved her from the Brennans and brought her here to die of fever in a freezing cabin. Maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't fit to raise her. No. Nate's voice was sharp enough to cut through her spiral of guilt. He reached out and took her shoulders gently. Listen to me. You saved that child from a family that would have broken her the same way they broke your sister. You gave her 3 years of love, 3 years of safety. That matters. She's still dead. Yes, and that's not your fault. Fever kills children out here every winter. You did everything you could. You rode through a blizzard to get a doctor. You stayed up for days trying to bring down her fever. You loved her. That's all anyone can do. Catherine looked up at him. His eyes were so clear, so certain. She wanted desperately to believe him. The Brennans might still come looking, she said. If they find out where I am, if Harrison sends someone, I'll lose everything again. Then we'll deal with it, Nate said simply. Together. The word hung in the air between them. Together. It was such a small word, but it carried so much weight. Catherine had been alone for so long, first in her grief over Rose, then in her fear of Harrison, then in her desperate journey west, then in her isolation after Silas's death. The idea of not being alone anymore was almost too much to hope for. Why, she asked. Why would you help me? You barely know me. Nate was quiet for a moment. Then he said, when my sister died, when Jenny drowned, and I couldn't save her, I thought I'd never forgive myself. My parents couldn't look at me, couldn't stand to be in the same room with me. I was a reminder of what we'd lost. He paused, his jaw working. They sent me away. Not because they were cruel, but because they couldn't bear it. I was 15. I ended up working ranches, moving from place to place. And you know what I learned? Catherine shook her head. That everyone's carrying something. Everyone's got some weight they're dragging behind them. And the people who survive, who keep going, they're the ones who find someone to help carry that weight, even if just for a little while. He looked at her directly. You're carrying too much alone. Let me help. Not because I pity you, not because I think you're weak, but because I know what it's like to carry grief and fear and guilt all by yourself. And I know it's too heavy for one person. Catherine felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking, opening, like ice breaking up in spring. What do I do? She asked. First, you stay safe. Move to the ranch for now. We have a spare cabin, small but weatherproof. I can't leave the Weatherby place. If I do, Wade will take it. Nate considered this. Then I'll stay nights at your cabin. In the barn. Keep watch. People will talk. Let them. His voice was firm. Your safety matters more than gossip. Before Catherine could respond, Sam appeared in the barn doorway. His expression was serious. Nate, need to talk to you. Private. Nate looked at Catherine. Wait here, I'll be right back. He stepped outside with Sam. Catherine could hear their low voices, but could not make out the words. When Nate returned a few minutes later, his face was troubled. What is it? Catherine asked. Sam just came from town. There's talk about you and me. Catherine's heart sank. What kind of talk? Mrs. Dorothy Hayes has been spreading it around that I'm spending too much time at your place, that it's not proper. An unmarried man and a widow woman. Heat flooded Catherine's face, part anger, part shame. I'll go to town. I'll talk to her. No. Nate's voice was gentle but immovable. I'll handle it. But Catherine, you need to know this is how small towns work. People talk, and in their talking, they can make your life very difficult. Then what do we do? Nate was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her. We could get married. Catherine stared at him. What? Not now, not like this, but eventually, if you wanted, it would solve the gossip problem. Give you legal claim to the Weatherby land through marriage to someone the town knows and trusts. Give you protection. That's not a reason to marry someone, Catherine said, her voice shaking. No. Nate agreed. It's not. Which is why I'm not asking now. I'm just saying it's an option. If things develop, if we find we suit each other. The careful way he said it, the respect in his voice for her autonomy, her choice made Catherine's eyes sting with fresh tears. He was not assuming, not demanding, just offering. I need to think, she said. Of course, no pressure. For now, let's just focus on keeping you safe and figuring out what Wade is planning. They spent the rest of the day working on Catherine's fence. Sam and Thomas, the ranch foreman, came along to help. By nightfall, the cattle were rounded up and the fence repaired. Nate made good on his promise, settling into Catherine's barn with a bedroll and his rifle. Catherine lay in her bed that night, listening to the wind and knowing that just outside in the barn, someone was keeping watch. Someone cared enough to lose sleep to keep her safe. It was the first night since Ruby's death that she slept more than a few hours. The next Sunday, Catherine attended church in town. It was the first time she had been to a service since the burial. She wore her black dress, her hair pulled back severely, trying to look respectable and unthreatening. Mrs. Dorothy Hayes was there, of course, a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She sat in the third pew with her husband, a mild-mannered man who seemed to have given up trying to moderate his wife's opinions years ago. Catherine took a seat in the back, trying to be inconspicuous, but she felt the eyes on her, heard the whispers. The whole town seemed to know about Nate's visits to her cabin, about him staying in her barn at night. After the service, as people gathered outside in the cold sunshine, Mrs. Hayes approached Catherine with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Mrs. Palmer, how are you holding up, dear? Well enough, thank you, Catherine said carefully. Such a tragedy, losing your daughter so soon after arriving, and poor Mr. Weatherby dying before you could even meet him. Dorothy's voice dripped with false sympathy. You must feel so alone. The community has been kind, Catherine said, though it was not entirely true. Yes, well, Dorothy glanced around, making sure she had an audience. I understand, Mr. Crawford has been particularly helpful. There it was, the trap. Catherine kept her voice level. Mr. Crawford has been a good neighbor. He's helped with repairs and fence work. Of course, Dorothy's smile sharpened. Though some might wonder if it's entirely proper, a young widow and an unmarried man spending so much time together. People do talk, you know. Catherine felt her face flush, but before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. They surely do talk, Mrs. Hayes. Question is whether what they're saying is worth listening to. Nate had appeared beside Catherine. He must have been standing nearby waiting. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, but there was steel underneath. Dorothy's eyes widened slightly. Mr. Crawford, I meant no offense. Didn't you, Nate's eyes were cold, because it sounded to me like you were implying something improper about Mrs. Palmer's character. And I'd hate to think you'd spread rumors about a grieving widow who's done nothing wrong except accept help from a neighbor. Several people had stopped to listen now. Dorothy's face reddened. I simply meant that appearances matter, Mr. Crawford. Surely you understand. I understand that Mrs. Palmer buried her daughter 3 weeks ago. I understand that she's alone in a harsh country trying to survive a winter that's killed stronger folks than her. I understand that the Christian thing to do is help her, not gossip about her. He paused, letting that sink in. So here's what I propose, Mrs. Hayes. Instead of talking about what I'm doing to help Catherine, why don't you do something helpful yourself? Take her some preserves. Check on her now and then. Be the neighbor you're supposed to be instead of the busybody you seem to prefer. Dorothy's mouth opened and closed. Several people in the crowd nodded. Even her husband looked like he was trying not to smile. Well, Dorothy finally managed, I never. Maybe you should start, Nate said mildly. He offered his arm to Catherine. Mrs. Palmer, may I walk you to your horse? Catherine took his arm, grateful for the solid warmth of him beside her. They walked through the crowd heads high. Behind them, the whispers started again, but they sounded different now. Less judgmental, more speculative. Thank you, Catherine said quietly when they were out of earshot. Don't thank me. I just told the truth. Nate's jaw was tight. Dorothy Hayes has always been more interested in other people's business than her own. But she's influential. Her opinion matters in this town. Did I just make things worse? No, you stood your ground. That matters more. He helped her mount her horse. But Catherine, this is just going to get harder. The longer I help you, the more people will talk. You need to decide if you can live with that. Can you? She asked. Nate looked up at her, his hand still on her horse's bridle. I stopped caring what people thought about me a long time ago. Only question that matters is what you think, what you want. Catherine looked down at him, at this quiet man who had appeared in her life at his darkest moment and refused to leave, who dug graves and fixed fences and stood up to town gossips on her behalf, who asked for nothing and gave everything. I want to understand something, she said. You talk about helping me, about being a good neighbor, but it's more than that, isn't it? Nate was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, yes, it's more than that. Then what is it? I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I'd like to find out, if you're willing. Catherine felt her heart beating hard in her chest. This was dangerous, caring about someone, letting them in. She had lost everyone she ever loved. Rose, Ruby, even Silas in a way, though she had never met him. But maybe Nate was right. Maybe everyone carried something too heavy to bear alone. Maybe the only way forward was to risk it anyway. I'm willing, she said quietly. Something shifted in Nate's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. He stepped back and released her horse. Then let's take it one day at a time, he said. For now, I need to do some research. About Silas's land, about his death. Something doesn't add up. What do you mean? I'll tell you when I know more, but I want to talk to Horace Bledsoe, the town lawyer. See if he knows anything about Silas's will or his plans for the property. 2 days later, Catherine and Nate rode into town together. Catherine needed supplies and Nate wanted to visit Bledsoe's office. They had decided it was better to be open about their friendship, to stop trying to hide or apologize for it. The town seemed quieter since the church confrontation. People still stared, but they did not approach. Dorothy Hayes crossed to the other side of the street when she saw them, which Catherine considered a small victory. While Catherine shopped at the general store, Nate went to see Horace Bledsoe. The lawyer's office was above the bank, a small, cramped space filled with papers and law books. Bledsoe himself was a thin, nervous man in his early 60s with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. Mr. Crawford, Bledsoe stood when Nate entered. What can I do for you? I want to ask about Silas Weatherby's will, Nate said directly. Bledsoe's face went carefully blank. That's confidential information. Silas is dead. Catherine Palmer was his intended bride. She has a right to know what his plans were for the property. Mrs. Palmer should come herself then. She's here, downstairs. I can get her if needed, but I'm asking as a friend of Silas's. We talk sometimes. He trusted me. Bledsoe sat back down slowly. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them, a delaying tactic. Then he sighed. All right, but this stays between us for now. Agreed. Bledsoe pulled out a file from his desk drawer. Silas came to see me a week before he died. He wanted to make an amendment to his will. He wanted to add someone to the deed as a beneficiary. Catherine Palmer. No, that's the strange part. Bledsoe opened the file and showed Nate a document. He wanted to add someone with the initials M.W. Margaret Weatherby. His dead wife? Yes, which made no sense, I told him so. Margaret had been dead for 15 years, but Silas insisted. He said he had his reasons, said he'd explain everything when he came back to sign the papers. But he never came back, Nate said slowly. No, he died that night. Horse threw him on the rocks up near Eagle Pass, broke his neck. Did you examine the horse, the saddle? Bledsoe's hands trembled slightly. I did, unofficially. The saddle girth was cut. Not all the way through, but enough that it would fail under stress. You told the sheriff. I tried. Sheriff Cole said I was imagining things. Said the girth probably just wore through from age. But I know what I saw, Mr. Crawford. That leather was cut deliberately. Nate felt cold settle into his gut. Silas was murdered. Bledsoe nodded miserably. I think so, but I can't prove it. And Sheriff Cole won't investigate. He's in Wade Garrett's pocket. Has been for years. Why would Wade want Silas dead? The water rights, the timber access. That property is worth a fortune to the right buyer. Silas wouldn't sell, so Wade found another way. And now he's trying to scare Catherine off the land. Yes, and if she won't scare, he'll find another way to get rid of her too. Bledsoe looked at Nate seriously. You need to protect her. Wade Garrett doesn't lose, not in this county. Nate left the lawyer's office with his mind racing. Silas had been murdered. The sheriff was corrupt. Wade was more dangerous than they had realized. And Catherine was sitting on land that men were willing to kill for. He found her at the general store paying for her supplies. She looked up when he entered, and something in his face made her freeze. What's wrong? She asked. We need to leave, now. They loaded her supplies quickly and rode out of town. Nate did not speak until they were well clear of buildings and people. Then he told her everything. About the cut saddle, about Silas's murder, about the mysterious amendment to the will. Catherine listened in growing horror. Margaret Weatherby, why would Silas add his dead wife to the deed? I don't know, but he thought it was important enough to risk alerting Wade that he was making changes. And he died before he could finish. You think Wade found out and killed him? I think it's likely. They rode in silence for a while. Then Catherine said quietly, I should leave. This land isn't worth dying for. It might not be about the land anymore, Nate said. Wade knows you've been talking to me, knows you're not going to be pushed around easily. He might see you as a threat now. Then what do I do? Before Nate could answer, 3 riders appeared from behind a stand of trees just ahead. They spread out across the road, blocking the way. Nate recognized the man in the center. Colt Branson, one of Wade's ranch hands, a mean drunk with a reputation for violence. Well, well, Colt said, grinning. Mrs. Palmer, Mr. Crawford, taking a trip to town together. How cozy. Nate's hand moved to the rifle on his saddle. Step aside, Colt. Now, why would I do that? Boss wants to have a word with the widow, alone. The other 2 men moved closer, flanking them. Catherine's horse sidled nervously. The widow's not interested in talking to your boss, Nate said calmly, but his heart was pounding. 3 against 1. Poor odds. Wasn't asking her interest, Colt said. He moved his horse closer to Catherine's. See, Mrs. Palmer, you're making things difficult. Wade Garrett made you a fair offer. Most widows would be smart enough to take it. Get away from her, Nate warned. Colt ignored him. He reached for Catherine's bridle. Maybe you just need some convincing. A woman alone can have all kinds of accidents out here. He grabbed the leather. Catherine's horse spooked, rearing slightly. Catherine held on but barely. Nate was moving before he thought about it, spurring his horse between Catherine and Colt, reaching for his rifle. Then a shot rang out. Everyone froze. From the ridge above them, Sam Tucker appeared, his rifle smoking. Let the lady go, Sam called down. Right now. This ain't your business, old man, Colt yelled back. Making it my business, Sam said calmly. Another rider appeared on the opposite ridge, Thomas Whitaker also armed. They had been following, Nate realized. Had anticipated trouble and positioned themselves to help. 3 against 3 now. Better odds. Colt released Catherine's bridle, his face darkening with anger. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Nate said. His voice was quiet but absolute. You tell Wade Garrett that Catherine Palmer is under my protection now. Mine's Sam's Thomas's and every decent man at the double bar. He wants to threaten her, he threatens all of us. Let him chew on that. Colt stared at him. Garrett won't like this. I don't care what Garrett likes. Nate's hand was still on his rifle. Now get out of our way. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Colt jerked his horse's head around and spurred away. His 2 companions followed. Sam and Thomas came down from their nares. Sam's eyes were bright with anger. Thomas's face was grim. You all right, ma'am? Thomas asked Catherine. Catherine nodded, though her hands were shaking on the reins. Thank you. Both of you. Let's get home, Nate said, before they decide to come back with more men. They rode hard for the double bar. Catherine's cabin was closer, but Nate did not think it was safe anymore. When they reached the ranch, Nate helped Catherine dismount. Her legs nearly gave out. The fear and adrenaline were catching up with her. "Come on," Nate said gently. He led her to the main house into the kitchen. Sam put coffee on. Thomas checked the perimeter, making sure they had not been followed. Catherine sat at the table trying to stop shaking. Nate sat across from her, waiting until she was ready to speak. Finally, she looked up at him. "They were going to hurt me. Maybe worse." "Yes. This is about more than just the land now." "Yes." Catherine's voice broke. "I don't know how to fight this. I don't know how to fight men like Wade Garrett." Nate reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than helping her mount a horse or steadying her after she stumbled. His hand was warm, calloused from work, solid and real. "You don't fight alone," he said. "That's the point. You have me. You have Sam and Thomas. You have people who will stand with you." "Why?" The word came out almost as a sob. "Why would you all risk yourselves for me?" "Because it's right," Nate said simply. "Because you're worth protecting. Because Wade Garrett doesn't get to win just because he's meaner and richer than everyone else." He paused, then added more quietly, "And because I care about you, more than I've cared about anyone in a very long time. And I'm not going to let anything happen to you if I can help it." Catherine stared at him. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of coffee percolating on the stove. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. "I care about you too," she said finally. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. "I didn't want to. I tried not to. But I do." Nate's hand tightened on hers. "Catherine." The kitchen door burst open. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete, stood there breathing hard. "Nate, you need to come. Ryder just came in from town. There's a man asking around about Mrs. Palmer. Rich-looking fella from back east. Says he's looking for his niece." Catherine went white. Nate felt her hand go cold in his. "Harrison Brennan," she whispered. "He found me." Back on the porch in 2024, Nate paused. Jake was gripping the arms of his chair, completely absorbed. "The brother-in-law," Jake said. "The one who wanted Ruby." "Yes, Harrison Brennan came to Laramie looking for Catherine, but Ruby was already dead. And Harrison didn't just want the child anymore." Nate's voice was grim. He wanted revenge. For what? For Catherine taking Ruby in the first place. For running. For making a fool of the Brennan family. Rich men like Harrison don't forgive that kind of insult. "What did he do?" Nate stood up, joints creaking. "That's a story for after dinner. We've been sitting too long. Come on, help me check on the horses. Then I'll tell you about the darkest week of my life. The week I thought I'd lose Catherine before I ever really had her." They walked down to the stables together. The sun was setting now, painting everything gold and red. Inside the barn, the horses nickered, softly, comfortable, and safe. "You know what I learned that week," Nate said as they distributed hay. "I learned that loving someone means being willing to lose them, means risking everything. And I learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand beside someone when the whole world's trying to tear them down." He looked at his grandson. "Emily would want you to be brave, Jake. Would want you to risk loving again someday. Not now, but someday." Jake nodded slowly, understanding, starting to dawn in his eyes. "Ready to hear what happened when Harrison Brennan came to town?" Nate asked. "Yes," Jake said. "Then let's head back. Because this is where things got really dark. This is where Catherine almost gave up. And this is where I had to decide if I was strong enough to fight for her. Not just against Wade Garrett, but against the law, against a rich, powerful man from the East, against everything that said we couldn't win." They walked back to the porch as the first stars came out, and Nate prepared to tell his grandson about the battle that would define the rest of his life. Harrison Brennan arrived in Laramie 3 days later. He rode in a private coach, dressed in clothes that cost more than most ranchers made in a year. Everything about him spoke of money and power, and the casual cruelty of men who had never been told no. He checked into the best hotel in town and immediately requested a meeting with Sheriff Edmund Cole. The sheriff, a man whose integrity had been for sale for so long he had forgotten what honesty felt like, was only too happy to accommodate a wealthy gentleman from Philadelphia. Catherine learned about it from Sam, who had been in town buying supplies. He rode back to the double bar at a gallop, his old mare lathered with sweat despite the cold. Rich man from the East, Sam reported, breathing hard, asking about Catherine Palmer, saying she kidnapped his niece, saying she's a criminal who needs to be brought to justice. Catherine sat in the main house of the double bar, where Nate had insisted she stay since the confrontation on the road. She felt the blood drain from her face. "He found me," she whispered. Nate was pacing, his jaw tight with anger. What evidence does he have Ruby's dead? What can he possibly claim now? "It doesn't matter," Catherine said dully. "Harrison has money. He has influence. He'll make up whatever evidence he needs. That's what he did in Philadelphia. That's what he'll do here." She stood up, her decision made. "I have to leave, tonight. If I'm gone, he can't hurt any of you. Can't drag you into this." "No," Nate's voice was absolute. "You're not running again. What choice do I have? You stay. You fight. You let us help you. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Harrison Brennan destroys people who cross him. It's what he does, and I've been crossing him for 3 years." Nate crossed the room and took her shoulders gently. "Then it's time someone stood up to him. Time someone showed him that money and power don't always win." Before Catherine could respond, Thomas burst through the door. "Nate, sheriff's coming. Got a deputy with him. They're heading up the drive now." Nate's hands dropped from Catherine's shoulders. "All right, Catherine, stay calm. Don't admit to anything. Don't volunteer information. Let me do the talking." They went outside together. Sheriff Cole rode up with his deputy, a young man named Miller, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Behind them in a separate carriage came Harrison Brennan. Catherine's breath caught when she saw him. He looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and cold eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. He smiled when he saw her, but it was the smile of a snake that had finally cornered its prey. "Mrs. Palmer," Sheriff Cole said, dismounting, "need you to come into town for some questions." "What kind of questions?" Nate asked, stepping slightly in front of Catherine. "That's between me and Mrs. Palmer," the sheriff said. Harrison Brennan climbed out of his carriage. "Actually, Sheriff, perhaps I should explain. Mr. Crawford, is it? I'm Harrison Brennan, Catherine's brother-in-law, and I'm here because this woman kidnapped my niece 3 years ago." "Ruby was my niece too," Catherine said, her voice shaking but clear. "My sister's daughter. Your sister Rose was married to my brother Robert. That made Ruby a Brennan. But you took her illegally, fled across state lines, and now the child is dead. Dead because of your negligence." "Ruby died of fever," Catherine said. "I rode 8 miles in a blizzard to get a doctor. I did everything I could. You dragged her to the middle of nowhere, to this godforsaken territory, and let her die in some freezing cabin." Harrison's voice was calm, reasonable, which made his words all the more terrible. "If you'd stayed in Philadelphia, if you'd given her to me as the court ordered, she'd be alive today." The words hit Catherine like physical blows, because part of her had thought the same thing. Part of her had wondered if running had been the right choice. If Ruby would still be alive if Catherine had just surrendered. "The court didn't order anything," Catherine said, but her voice was weak. "I left before the judgment." "Exactly. You fled with a child who wasn't legally yours. That's kidnapping, Mrs. Palmer. And I have documents to prove it." Harrison turned to the sheriff. "I've filed charges. I expect her to be arrested and held for trial." "Now hold on," Nate said. "You can't just ride into town and start arresting people without evidence." "I have plenty of evidence." Harrison pulled papers from his coat. "Letters from Rose saying she wanted me to raise Ruby if anything happened to her. Testimony from the family physician stating that Catherine was an unfit guardian. Court documents that showing the proceedings that were underway." "Those letters are forgeries," Catherine said desperately. "Rose never wanted you near Ruby. She was terrified of the Brennans." "Can you prove that?" Harrison asked mildly. "Because I can prove my claims. I have signatures, witnesses, legal documents. What do you have? The word of a woman who ran away in the night with a child and let her die." Sheriff Cole cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Palmer, I'm going to ask you to come with me for questioning." "This is ridiculous," Nate said. "Ruby's been dead for weeks. What's the point of this?" "Justice," Harrison said simply, "and compensation. Mrs. Palmer also happens to be living on valuable land. Land I believe has some connection to my family. I intend to pursue all legal avenues available to me." And there it was, the real reason. Harrison didn't just want revenge, he wanted the land. Somehow he had discovered the value of the Weatherby property and decided to take it as compensation for Ruby's death. You can't take her, Nate said, his hand moving toward his gun. Nate, don't. Catherine's voice was quiet but firm. She looked at the sheriff. I'll come, but I want it on record that I'm cooperating voluntarily, that I have nothing to hide. Catherine, Nate started. It's all right. She looked at him, trying to memorize his face. I've been running for 3 years. Maybe it's time to stop. They took her to town in the sheriff's wagon. Nate followed on horseback, unable to stop them, but refusing to let Catherine out of his sight. Sam and Thomas rode with him, grim-faced and silent. At the jail, they locked Catherine in the single cell. It was small, cold, with one narrow window. Catherine sat on the hard cot and tried not to think about what would happen next. Trial, conviction, prison maybe, or worse. That night, Thomas brought her food from the hotel. The deputy Miller allowed it. He was young enough to still have some conscience. Mr. Crawford's talking to the lawyer, Thomas said quietly through the bars, trying to figure out a defense. Catherine just nodded. She had no hope left for defense. Harrison was too powerful, too connected. He would win because he always won. While Catherine sat in jail, Nate was indeed talking to Horace Bledsoe. The lawyer's office was dark except for one lamp, and Bledsoe looked older than his years. There must be something, Nate insisted. Some way to fight this. Against Harrison Brennan, Bledsoe shook his head. The man has unlimited resources. He's already paid the sheriff handsomely. I'd bet money he's paying the judge too once he gets one assigned. Then we find evidence, real evidence, about Silas's murder, about Wade's involvement. We expose the whole thing. Bledsoe was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and went to his safe. He pulled out a thick folder. Silas gave me this, he said, the day before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should keep it safe. Show it to the right person. He handed the folder to Nate. Inside were letters, documents, a journal. Nate read quickly, his heart pounding harder with each page. Silas had known he was in danger, had documented everything. Wade's threats, his attempts to buy the land, and then the crucial detail, a letter from Margaret Weatherby, Silas's first wife, written months before she died. In it, Margaret revealed that she had been born Margaret Brennan. She was Harrison and Robert's sister. She had fled the Brennan family 20 years earlier, changed her name, married Silas, and tried to escape the toxic influence of her brothers. She had written about their cruelty, their greed, their willingness to destroy anyone who crossed them. And then in her final paragraphs, Margaret had written about meeting her sister Rose, about learning that Rose had married Robert, about her horror when she realized Rose was being abused. She had tried to help, but Robert had forbidden Rose from seeing her. Margaret had died, never knowing what happened to her sister or if Rose had escaped. But she had made Silas promise one thing. If any child of Rose's ever needed help, Silas was to provide it, to protect them from the Brennans at any cost. That's why Silas had advertised for a mail-order bride named Catherine Palmer. He had known. Somehow he had found out about Catherine and Ruby, had reached out to her specifically, had offered her sanctuary, and Wade Garrett, learning of Silas's plans, had killed him for it. This changes everything, Nate breathed. Does it? Bledsoe asked. It proves Silas's motivation, but it doesn't prove Harrison committed any crime. Doesn't prove Catherine's innocence of the kidnapping charge. But it proves Harrison is lying about wanting justice for Ruby. He's after the land that was meant to protect Rose's daughter from him. Proving motivation isn't the same as proving innocence in court. Nate stood, tucking the documents inside his coat. Then I need to find more. I need to talk to Wade, get him to admit what he and Harrison planned. That's dangerous. I don't care. Nate left the lawyer's office and rode straight to the Iron Creek Ranch. It was past midnight, but lights were still burning in the main house. Nate dismounted and walked up to the front door. He didn't knock. He kicked it open. Wade Garrett was sitting in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't look surprised to see Nate. Mr. Crawford, breaking and entering now. You murdered Silas Weatherby, Nate said flatly. Wade smiled. That's quite an accusation. Can you prove it? I don't need to prove it to you. I just need you to know that I know, and that I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too. Good luck with that. Sheriff's in my pocket. Judge will be too. And Harrison Brennan is about to own that land legally through Catherine Palmer's conviction. Everything's working out nicely. You're working with Harrison. Of course, he contacted me months ago, said his sister-in-law was on the run with his niece, asked if I'd heard anything about a mail-order bride coming to the area. When I learned Catherine was Silas's intended, I realized the opportunity. Kill Silas, take the land, split it with Harrison. Everyone wins. Except Silas and Catherine and Ruby. Wade shrugged. Casualties of business. Nate's hand moved toward his gun. Wade was faster, his pistol already drawn. Don't, Wade warned. I'd be within my rights to shoot you for breaking into my home. Nate forced himself to breathe, to think. He couldn't help Catherine if he was dead. You won't get away with this, he said. I already have. Wade's smile widened. Catherine will be convicted. Harrison will take the land as compensation. I'll buy my half from him, and you, Mr. Crawford, will learn that sometimes the bad guys win. Nate backed toward the door, his mind racing. He couldn't fight Wade physically, couldn't outshoot him, but he had gotten what he came for. A confession. Wade's arrogance had made him careless. As Nate mounted his horse, he saw a figure in the shadows. Sam Tucker, who had followed him, had been listening at the window. He gave Nate a small nod. They had a witness now. It wasn't much, but it was something. They rode back to town as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. At the jail, they found Thomas keeping watch outside. No one was getting to Catherine without going through him first. Any luck? Thomas asked. Some. Not enough. Nate looked up at the small window of Catherine's cell. He could see her silhouette sitting motionless on the cot. I need to talk to her. Deputy Miller, who was on duty, was sympathetic but firm. Can't let you in the cell, Mr. Crawford, but you can talk through the bars. Catherine came to the bars when she heard Nate's voice. In the dim light of the cell, she looked small and defeated. I'm going to get you out, Nate said. I have evidence, I have witnesses, I just need a little more time. It won't matter, Catherine said. Her voice was hollow. Harrison always wins. He won in Philadelphia, and he'll win here. Catherine, look at me. She raised her eyes to his. I'm not going to let him win. Not this time. Not you. Why? The word came out broken. Why are you doing this? You could walk away. Save yourself. Because I love you. The words hung in the cold air between them. Nate hadn't planned to say them. Not like this. Not in a jail with bars between them and deputies listening. But they were true, and she needed to hear them. I love you, he repeated. I think I've loved you since the first moment I saw you trying to dig that grave alone. And I'm not going to lose you. Not to Harrison Brennan. Not to anything. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I love you too. That's why you have to let me go. If I'm convicted, if I go to prison or worse, I don't want you to suffer for it. Not going to happen, Nate said firmly. Trust me, just a little longer. Can you do that? Catherine wanted to say yes, wanted to believe him. But hope was dangerous. Hope hurt worse than despair. Before she could answer, the jail door burst open. A man in a federal marshal's badge walked in, followed by two deputies. I'm Marshal Daniel Hayes from Cheyenne, he announced. I'm looking for Sheriff Cole. He's at home, Deputy Miller said. Can I help you? I'm here to investigate Harrison Brennan, bank fraud, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder. We've been building a case for months. Heard he was in Laramie, thought I'd pay a visit. Nate felt hope surge in his chest. Marshal, I have information about Silas Weatherby's murder, about a conspiracy between Brennan and Wade Garrett. The marshal's eyes sharpened. Tell me everything. Over the next hour, Nate laid it all out, showed the marshal Silas's documents, had Sam testify to what they'd heard at Wade's ranch, explained about Margaret Brennan and her connection to both Silas and Harrison. The marshal listened intently. When Nate finished, he said, This corroborates what we already suspected. Harrison Brennan has been running schemes across 3 states, using his bank connections to defraud investors, threatening witnesses, buying off officials. We just needed one more piece to build our case. He looked at Catherine in her cell. Mrs. Palmer, the kidnapping charges against you are bogus. Rose Brennan left her daughter to you in her will. We found the original document in her safety deposit box. Harrison forged the letters claiming otherwise. You're free to go. Catherine stared at him, unable to process the words. Free. She was free. Marshall Hayes unlocked the cell himself. As Catherine stepped out, Nate caught her before her knees could give way. He held her tight while she shook with relief and disbelief. What about Harrison? Nate asked, and Wade. My deputies are arresting Wade Garrett as we speak. Harrison Brennan will be in custody within the hour. They'll both stand trial, and this time they won't buy their way out. Everything happened quickly after that. Harrison was arrested at his hotel protesting and threatening lawsuits. Wade tried to fight and was subdued by the marshal's men. Both were transported to Cheyenne to await trial. Sheriff Cole, realizing his corruption would be exposed, resigned, and left town in the night. No one mourned his departure. The legal proceedings took weeks, but in the end both Harrison and Wade were convicted. Wade of murder and conspiracy, Harrison of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. They were both sentenced to hang. Catherine was officially cleared of all charges. More than that, Horace Bledsoe worked with the marshal's office to establish her legal claim to the Weatherby property. Silas's will was honored. The land was hers. But the victory felt hollow. Catherine had what she'd fought for: safety, security, legal protection. But Ruby was still dead. Rose was still dead, and no amount of justice could bring them back. The days after the trial were strange for Catherine. She returned to the Weatherby cabin, but it felt different now. Empty in a way it hadn't before. She had fought so hard to keep this land, but now that she had it, she wasn't sure what to do with it. Nate came by every day as always, but something had shifted between them. The crisis was over. The immediate danger had passed, and in the space left behind, they had to figure out what they were to each other without the urgency of survival driving them together. One morning in late March, Nate arrived to find Catherine sitting by Ruby's grave. She had planted the first spring flowers there, small purple crocuses pushing through the last of the snow. She came here often, talking to the grave as if Ruby could hear. Nate didn't interrupt. He just sat down beside her on the cold ground and waited. I don't know how to let her go, Catherine said finally. Everyone tells me it will get easier with time, but it doesn't feel easier. It just feels different, heavier. It doesn't get easier, Nate said quietly, but you get stronger, strong enough to carry it. Catherine looked at him. How long did it take after Jenny died? 15 years before I could talk about her without my throat closing up. 20 before I could remember the good times without drowning in the bad. I don't know that I'm ever done grieving her. I just learned to make room for other things alongside the grief. What things? Nate picked up a handful of soil, let it run through his fingers. Purpose, work, friendship, and eventually love. He looked at Catherine directly. I meant what I said at the jail. I love you. That hasn't changed. But I need you to know I'm not asking you to be healed. Not asking you to be done grieving. I'm just asking if you can imagine someday making room for something else alongside the pain. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I'm scared. Of what? Of loving you and losing you. Everyone I love dies. Rose, Ruby, even Silas, who I never met but who tried to save me. What if I'm cursed? What if caring about people kills them? Nate took her hand. You're not cursed. You're just human. And humans lose people. It's what we do. We love and we lose, and somehow we find the courage to love again anyway. I don't know if I have that courage. You do. You had the courage to run from Philadelphia with Ruby, to start over in a strange place, to fight Harrison and Wade, to stand up in court and tell your truth. You're the bravest person I know, Catherine. She leaned her head on his shoulder. They sat there for a long time beside Ruby's grave as the sun moved across the sky and the spring wind blew cold and clean. Finally, Catherine spoke. I want to do something with this land, something that matters, something that would make Ruby's death mean something. What do you have in mind? A place for children who have nowhere else. Orphans like Ruby would have been if I'd failed, like you were after your parents died. A ranch where they can be safe and loved and given a chance. Nate was quiet, absorbing this. Then he smiled. An orphanage. More than that, a home. A real home. Where they can learn ranching and music and reading. Where they can heal from whatever brought them to us. We, Nate noticed. You said we. Catherine lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. I can't do it alone. I don't want to do it alone. If I'm going to build something that lasts, I need someone beside me. Someone I trust. Someone who understands. Are you asking me to help you run an orphanage? I'm asking you to build a life with me, to buy all this pain and grief and somehow make it into something good, to prove that love can survive loss, that hope can grow even in frozen ground. Nate stood and pulled Catherine to her feet. Then I have something to ask you, properly this time. He took both her hands in his. Catherine Palmer, would you marry me? Not because it's practical or convenient, not because the town gossips need to be satisfied, but because I love you. Because I want to wake up beside you every morning and work beside you every day and know that whatever comes, we face it together. Catherine looked at him, at this quiet man who had stopped to help a stranger dig a grave and ended up changing her life, who had fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, who loved her not despite her brokenness, but with full knowledge of it. Yes, she said. When I'm ready, yes. Nate pulled her close and kissed her. It was gentle and promising, and full of all the tomorrows they would build together. Over the next months, they began planning. Not just the wedding, but the future. They would combine the Weatherby land with the resources of the double bar. Sam and Thomas agreed to help to teach the children ranching skills. Catherine would teach music and reading. They would build additional cabins for the children. Create a real home. Word spread through the territory. By summer, the first child arrived. A boy named Matthew, 10 years old, whose parents had died of cholera. He was angry and scared and didn't trust anyone. Catherine saw herself in him. Nate saw himself. They gave him time, space, and most importantly, presence. They showed up every day. They didn't give up on him. Within weeks, Matthew started to soften, started to smile, started to believe he might belong somewhere. By autumn, 3 more children had arrived. The ranch was transforming. No longer just a place of grief, but a place of healing, of second chances. And in September, as the aspen trees turned gold and the air took on the crisp edge of coming winter, Nathaniel Crawford and Catherine Palmer were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Sam and Thomas stood as witnesses. The 4 children attended dressed in their Sunday best. Mrs. Dorothy Hayes even came bringing a beautiful quilt she had made as a wedding gift. She had become one of Catherine's most ardent supporters, embarrassed by her earlier gossip and determined to make amends. The ceremony was short, the vows traditional. But when Nate looked at Catherine in her simple blue dress with wild flowers in her hair, he felt something click into place. A rightness, a sense of home he hadn't felt since before Jenny died. I now pronounce you man and wife, the preacher said. Nate kissed his wife, and in that moment, surrounded by children who had found hope standing on land that had been bought with so much pain, Catherine finally felt what had eluded her for so long. Peace. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of something strong enough to carry her through it. That night, as they stood on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset, Catherine said, "Do you think she knows Ruby?" Nate asked. "Yes. Do you think she knows what we're building? That something good came from her death?" Nate pulled Catherine close. "I think she knows. I think they all know. Ruby and Jenny and Rose and everyone we've lost. I think they see what we're doing here, and they're proud." Catherine turned in his arms to look at him. "I used to think loving you was dangerous, that I'd lose you like I lost everyone else. And now I think loving you was the bravest thing I ever did, and I'm not sorry, not for 1 minute of it." They stood together as darkness fell, 2 people who had found each other in grief and built something beautiful from the ashes. The years passed like water over stones, smoothing the rough edges, changing everything slowly. By 1890, the Crawford Ranch had 20 children in residence. Some were adopted by families in the area. Others stayed growing up to work the ranch themselves. Catherine taught them music in the evenings, her violin singing out across the prairie. Nate taught them how to read the weather, how to gentle a horse, how to survive in a hard land. They built a small schoolhouse, hired a teacher, established a fund for the children's futures. The ranch became known throughout the territory as a place of hope, where broken children could become whole. In 1895, the first child they had taken in, Matthew, married a girl from town. They held the wedding at the ranch, and Catherine played her violin while they danced. She was 40 years old now, with threads of gray in her dark hair, and she had never been happier. More children came. The ranch expanded. By 1900, they had taken in over 60 children. Some stayed just months. Others stayed years. But every single one left knowing they had been loved, knowing they mattered. Nate and Catherine never had children of their own. But they had hundreds of children, children who called them Ma and Pa, children who came back years later with their own families to say thank you, to introduce their babies to the people who had saved them. In 1910, the territorial government officially recognized the Crawford Ranch as a charitable organization. They provided funding for expansion. By 1920, there were 3 buildings dedicated to housing children, a full school, a workshop where older children learned trades. Catherine's violin, the one that had belonged to Rose, hung on the wall of the main house. She still played it sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the children were in bed, and she and Nate sat on the porch watching the stars. "Do you ever regret it?" Nate asked one such evening. They were both 60 now, their bodies showing the years of hard work. "Regret what?" "Not having a quiet life, just the two of us, not taking on all these children, all this responsibility." Catherine took his hand. "Not for one second. This is what I was meant to do, what we were meant to do. Ruby's death doesn't hurt less, but it means something now. Every child we save is a testament to her, to Rose, to everyone we lost." Nate kissed her weathered hand. "I love you more today than I did the day we married." "How is that possible? You loved me quite a lot then." "Because every year with you, every child we help, every sunrise we watch together, it all adds up. Love doesn't stay the same, it grows, like flowers from frozen ground." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Inside the house, children slept safe and warm. Tomorrow there would be work to do, meals to cook, lessons to teach. But tonight there was just peace. Catherine lived to be 78. She died quietly one morning in 1924, sitting in her chair on the porch looking out over the land she had transformed. Nate found her there, a small smile on her face, her violin beside her. He buried her next to Ruby's grave. The marker read, "Catherine Crawford, 1860 to 1924, Angel of Wyoming, beloved wife and mother to hundreds." Nate lived another 10 years without her. He kept the ranch going, kept taking in children, kept Catherine's vision alive. When he died in 1934 at the age of 80, they buried him beside her. His stone read simply, "Nathaniel Crawford, 1854 to 1934. He stopped when no one else would. But the ranch didn't die with them. The children they had raised carried it on. Matthew became the director. Other children stayed to teach, to run the operations, to keep the mission alive. The Catherine Crawford Memorial Children's Home operated straight through the Depression, through World War II, through all the decades that followed. Back on the porch in 2024, Nate Crawford finished his story as the last light faded from the sky. Jake had tears running down his face. "She built all that," Jake said, "from losing her daughter, from almost losing everything." "Yes," Nate said quietly. "She took the worst thing that ever happened to her and transformed it into the best thing she ever did." "And you," Jake said, "you gave up your whole life to help her." "No, Huerto." Nate shook his head. "I didn't give up anything. I found everything, purpose, family, love that lasted beyond death. Catherine gave me all of that." He stood slowly, his old joints protesting. "Come on, I want to show you something." They walked through the twilight to the cemetery where the first Crawfords were buried. There beside Ruby's small grave were the markers for Catherine and the first Nathaniel. The gardens Catherine had planted still bloomed, carefully tended by generations of children who had come after. "This is where it all started," Nate said. "Right here, when I stopped to help a stranger dig a grave in frozen ground. Every good thing in my life came from that moment. Every child we saved, every life we touched, it all traces back to one decision: to stop, to help, to care when it would have been easier not to." Jake knelt by the graves. "What am I supposed to do, Grandpa? How do I live without Emily? The same way Catherine lived without Ruby, the same way I lived without Catherine after she died. One day at a time, one choice at a time. You choose to get up. You choose to keep going. You choose to let yourself love again someday." "I don't think I can." "You don't have to think you can. You just have to do it anyway." Catherine didn't think she could survive, but she did. Not because she was strong enough, but because she was brave enough to accept help, to let me stand beside her, to build something bigger than her pain. Nate put his hand on his grandson's shoulder. Emily's death will change you. It already has. But you get to choose what that change looks like. You can let it destroy you, or you can let it transform you into someone who understands suffering and uses that understanding to help others. They stood there in the growing darkness, 3 generations connected by loss and love. In the distance, lights were coming on in the Catherine Crawford Memorial Children's Home. Children were having dinner, doing homework, playing games, living lives full of possibility because 2 people had chosen hope over despair 90 years ago. The home is still operating, Jake asked. Every single day. We house about 40 children right now, some short-term, some long-term. All of them get what Catherine and I got, a chance, a place to heal, people who won't give up on them. Nate smiled in the darkness. Your grandmother's been gone 70 years, but her love is still saving children, still giving hope to people who thought they had none left. That's legacy, Jake. That's what happens when you take your grief and transform it into something beautiful. Jake was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I wanted to help with the home. I want to do something that matters, something Emily would be proud of. Then we'll find a place for you. The children always need teachers, mentors, people who understand what it's like to hurt. They walked back toward the house together. Jake moved a little lighter now, as if some of the weight he'd been carrying had shifted. Not gone, but more bearable. Thank you for telling me this, Grandpa, for sharing her story, your story. That's what stories are for, Nate said, to show us we're not alone, to prove that pain doesn't have to be the end, to remind us that spring always comes even after the longest winter. They reached the porch and sat in their chairs. Nate poured fresh whiskey into both glasses. This time Jake drank. To Catherine, Nate said, raising his glass to the stars. To Catherine, Jake echoed. And to Emily, and to everyone we've loved and lost. And to what we build from the ashes, Nate added. To hope, to healing, to love that's strong enough to survive anything. They drank together as the night settled around them. In the distance, the sound of children's laughter drifted from the memorial home. Somewhere, Catherine's violin sat in its case waiting for the next person brave enough to make music from grief. And on a small grave in a quiet cemetery, flowers bloomed in the place where a mail-order bride had once tried to dig through frozen ground alone, where a cowboy had stopped to help, where everything had changed. The world was hard and cruel and beautiful all at once. People died, hearts broke, but love endured, hope survived. And if you were very lucky, very brave, you found someone to walk beside you through the darkness until morning came. That was Catherine's legacy. That was what she and Nate had built together from frozen ground and broken hearts. And it would keep growing, keep spreading, keep giving hope to lost children for as long as there were people willing to stop when they saw someone digging alone. As long as there were people brave enough to love despite the risk of loss. As long as spring kept returning after winter. Forever.